Imagine my surprise back in March when 14 CEOs from the oil and gas industry sent a letter to Canadian politicians, and they had a bunch of demands in it, and one of them was to eliminate the industrial emitter carbon tax. The reason this was a surprise is because a decade ago, when I was covering the issue, they were all for it. And there's a story behind this. It's a really interesting story, and it kind of illustrates how things have changed in the Alberta oil patch. So where this starts is with Zipporah Berman, who was a well-known environmentalist at that time, still is. And she and a group of people had created this tar sands campaign, and they had gotten some funding from American charities and foundations, and it turned out to be about $40 million over roughly 7 or 8 years. So it wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough money that it certainly created a lot of heat, because they did a lot with a little, created a lot of heat for the oil sands, and basically they had damaged the international reputation. And what that means is that New York investors, for example, were reluctant to put money into the oil sands. They didn't want to be connected with a controversial industry. So a group of oil sands CEOs, there were 5 of them, approached Dave Collier, who was coming to the end of his tenure at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, CAP, and they said, "Look, Dave, see if you can't reach out to people on the environmental groups, and let's get together, get us all in a room, and let's thrash this out and see if we can't create some peace in the valley." That was the term. So Dave went to Zipporah, and she went to some of the executive directors of some different groups. There was Ed Whittingham from the Pembina Institute, and Tim Gray from Environmental Defense, and there were some others. And so they arranged to get together. The first meeting was September of 2014 at an Italian restaurant in Calgary. And they went in, and in my interview with Ed Whittingham, because I interviewed a lot of people for this story, but my interview with Ed Whittingham, he said, each side thought the other side had horns and a tail. Because they were the devil, and there really was a lot of intense dislike and mistrust at the beginning. But over the course of time, over the course of talking over the various issues, they've discovered that in fact they had a lot in common, and much more than they had expected. And they had some very frank and very difficult conversations. But by the spring of 2015, they had actually come to a handshake agreement. They had a deal, and the deal basically was that the tar sands campaign would back off, and the environmental groups would back off, I think is a better way to describe it. And in return, the oil sands CEOs agreed to back some policy changes. One of them was to reduce methane emissions by 45%. Another one was to put a 100 megaton a year greenhouse gas emissions cap on the oil sands, and there were some other ones. And one of them was, of course, the support for carbon pricing. I guess that's probably the big one. Now, I should hasten to add that even though this group had come to kind of a handshake agreement, I mean, still, this is policy, right? So the government has to Alberta government has to implement it. And the Alberta government, which was the NDP under Rachel Notley, they had just won the election in May of 2015. They had commissioned energy economist Professor Andrew Leach from the University of Alberta to go around and consult on carbon or climate policies, and he came back and with his recommendations, and carbon pricing was one of them, methane emission reductions was one of them. There was one that wasn't, and that eventually found its way into the Alberta government's climate leadership plan, which was announced in 2015, and that was the 100 megaton emissions cap on the oil sands. Anyway, so they agreed on these, the executive directors and the CEOs, and they went in September to Edmonton, and they met with Shannon Phillips, who at that time was the Minister of Environment. They met with her on the 5th floor of the legislature in her office, and they laid out what they'd been doing and the agreement they had come to. And when I interviewed Phillips, she said that she looked at them and she went, "Are you nuts? Like, why would you agree to this?" And so they had that conversation, and then the CEOs explained what they got out of it. And so she said, "Okay, I'll take this to the Premier and we'll see where it goes." And so they used some of that input into the climate leadership plan. But it wasn't so much the ideas as it was the political support that became really important, because when Notley announced it in November, who was standing behind her right on the podium, you can see it in the photos, 4 oil sands CEOs. Now that's a big deal for an NDP government, because they were seen, even at that time in the oil patch, they were seen as an accidental government that, kind of, there was a vote split that allowed them to sneak up the middle. Nobody expected them to win. Rachel Notley was already being demonized, as an oil and gas hater and someone who wanted to tear down the phase out the Alberta oil and gas industry, that kind of stuff. None of it was true, of course, but that this was the narrative. So anyway, the climate leadership plan came in, and the companies were behind it. Now, at 2016, 2017, I did a lot of interviews inside the industry with people like Harbir China, who was the VP of Technology at Cenovus Energy. And they had been doing a lot of work. In the case of Cenovus, it's called solvent substitution. So they use steam-assisted gravity drainage, which basically is you have a well and you have 2 laterals, one on top of the other, and one emits or injects steam into the bitumen and makes it more less viscous, so it'll flow, and then the other one collects it, right? And so it's the burning the natural gas, or petcoke, which is even worse, but burning the natural gas to create steam that creates the high greenhouse gas emissions. And so they were looking for ways to achieve what they needed, which is to make the bitumen flow, but without doing it without steam, or at least reducing the amount of steam in the short term. And so they came up with this idea of, instead of injecting steam, they would inject a light hydrocarbon, kind of like Varsol. If you've ever, got grease on your hands, worked on your car, and you took it off with Varsol, so it's, that kind of thing. And they were really optimistic that they were going to be able to roll this out in a big way, and it would bring their emissions down. And under the industrial emitters carbon tax, companies that actually exceeded the benchmarks would actually get credits, and then they could sell the credits to other producers, and so they were really hepped up on it, and they were very, very clear about why. And I remember China saying this to me. He said, in the future, because we know that climate policy is going to get stricter and stricter and stricter, and it's going to put us at a competitive disadvantage. He said, and I quote, "We have to be cost and carbon competitive." So, and to their credit, they had brought down their production costs way down. It's a much lower break-evens than it was even 10 years ago. And they have made strides in reducing their emissions intensity per barrel. It used to be 83 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel back in 2009. Now it's 66. So it's still very high, but it's lower than it was, and that's what. And so they thought that they would eventually either eliminate emissions, get it down to net zero, or they would be at least as low as your average North American crude, which is around 31 kilograms per barrel, that kind of thing. Fast forward though, a lot of those CEOs were bounced shortly after, because not everybody liked that, the climate leadership plan or the CEO's role in it. Now, I interviewed Tim McMillan from CAP, who succeeded Dave Collier, and he told me, he said very clearly, that was an oil sands sector negotiation, and it did not and was not supported by CAP or by any of the conventional producers, and even some of the smaller oil sands producers. And so there was a lot of tension between those two camps for a long time. And I think essentially what happened is that the more conciliatory elements, like those 5 oil sands CEOs, were all bounced. They were all replaced, and they brought in more hardcore CEOs. And then over the last year or two, that's even been more pronounced, because the investors are demanding so much money back from the companies in the form of higher dividends and share buybacks. And so the companies, that's where they're focused, is improving their bottom line, not on reducing emissions, and they're trying to eliminate every bit of cost they can, including the industrial emitters carbon tax. And that's a whole different, you can read some of the, or watch some of the videos I've done on that, about how the Alberta, the tier carbon tax actually has been diluted, and it really, instead of $95 a ton, which is the headline price, it's more like $27 a ton, which is peanuts for these companies, nevertheless. But I'll close this video by saying this. All the times that I've told this story, and you know, I wrote it, 3 or 4 columns about it in 2018, reported on it, I had so many people in the oil patch say, that never happened. Well, it did happen. I mean, I had one of the VPs of Suncor gave me an on the record interview, and Arlene Strom. And she talked about it. And if you go into, Suncor used to have a magazine that they put out every month or every quarter, and there's an interview with Ed Whittingham and Arlene Strom where they talk about the whole thing, everything that I reported. So, folks, it happened, trust me. But in the oil patch, fact and evidence are not as important as you think they would be, right? And so there are lots of people who just absolutely flat out refuse to believe that this happened. It did, and now you know the story.